guys, it's me, Christina. First of all, I want to apologize for being gone so long. Life has been crazy and unfortunately my health hasn't been the best, but I am back now. I want you guys to know that I hear your requests for videos about some of the spinal issues I have and some of the braces that I wear. Those videos are both definitely in the works, but I'm not quite sure if I feel like I'm at the right stage yet. Like both of those topics are kind of a big work in progress for me, so I'm not quite sure if I'm really ready to put those videos out there yet. I always try to give you guys the best information that I possibly can, and I feel like I just need to wait a little bit so I can do that. Anyway, today I wanted to focus on my feeding tube. This is something I get a lot of questions and messages about, and so I thought I would answer the most frequently asked questions here in a video. The first question is, why do you have a feeding tube? For me, there are a few different reasons. For most of my life, I've had trouble with food. A lot of different foods would just make me sick. I was always really nauseous, always had stomach pain. Oftentimes, it wouldn't really matter what I ate, just eating anything would make me really sick. Over the years, as my health started to decline, so did my GI function, and I also noticed I was having problems with swallowing. I started having allergic reactions to more and more foods until I was reacting to almost everything I ate. This led me to getting a diagnosis of mast cell activation syndrome. My immune system was recognizing food, especially certain trigger foods, as an allergen and attacking it, causing a huge allergic response throughout my whole body. Then my gastric emptying started to slow down even further, and everything I ate would just sit in my stomach and make me so nauseous. I would lie awake for hours every single night just trying not to throw up, and I was only sometimes successful. This year, after one of my surgeries, my symptoms took a major turn for the worst. I was reacting to every single food, even the smell. I could only swallow if I was laying completely flat, and anything I ate I would vomit up completely undigested, sometimes even up to a day later. This is when it started to get dangerous. I noticed that I was vomiting up full pills that should have dissolved hours ago. I started to inhale things or choke when I was trying to swallow. I was starting to get really weak and dehydrated. I was really anemic. They wanted to do a blood transfusion. And plus my medications weren't working correctly because they weren't staying down. I was away from home because we had traveled for my spinal surgery, so I had to go to the local ER. They performed a barium swallow study, which I bombed. They found that anything I swallowed was getting stuck in my esophagus, somewhere about here in my chest, and just wouldn't go down, no matter how much I swallowed. In fact, if I tried to wash it down with water, they could see that the water was all backing up behind it and getting caught too. We even tried waiting a while, giving it like 10-15 minutes, see if it would go down, and it hadn't moved at all. This explained my vomiting, why my medications weren't working, and it also explained why I was having prolonged reactions to trigger foods as they weren't leaving my system. At this point, the GI and the swallow specialist both agreed that my best option was probably a feeding tube, and so I had it placed the next day through a direct ER admission. The second question I get asked a lot is, can you still eat? Can I eat? Yes. As with any feeding tube, you can still eat, in theory. But do I eat? No. The symptoms are just simply not worth it. And if I was eating, it would really just defeat the purpose of having the tube placed in the first place. Even things like the smell of food or chewing gum still make me react, so it just isn't worth it. I'll just stick to drinking water for now. Is it permanent? I guess the best answer to this question is, I don't really know. I'm currently undergoing treatment for my mast cell problems, and I'm hoping maybe as I get further into treatment, my body will calm down and I'll be able to tolerate a few different foods. I would probably have to begin by blending some foods and trying it through the G-tube first, but I'm really hoping that as I move further from some of my cervical surgeries, some of the nerves in my neck and in my throat will start to regenerate and I will gain better ability to swallow again. Also, I should mention that I grind and dissolve all of my medications and use those through the G-tube, and they have never worked better. Even if I could eat again, I feel like I would still want to keep the G-tube around for a while so that my medications work properly. The next question that a lot of people ask me is why they decided to do a G-tube. If you didn't know, there are quite a few options for feeding tubes. What I have, a G-tube, also known as a gastronomy tube, is a tube that goes straight through from the front of the abdominal wall right into your stomach. But there are other types as well. For example, there is a J-tube, which is just like a G-tube, but instead of going directly into your stomach, it goes directly into part of your small intestine. Then there are the less permanent versions, like an NG tube, an NJ tube, or an ND tube. Those are threaded through the nose and down the throat, but they serve the same purposes. Having just a G-tube placed was not actually our original plan. Our original plan was for me to have a GJ tube placed, which would go into both my stomach and my small intestine. That way I could get my medications right into my stomach where they had to be absorbed, and then we could do nutrition through the intestine. I was never offered the option of an NG or an NJ tube. I assume that's because I had just had spinal surgeries and I already had swelling in my throat, as well as the fact that we knew that it was going to be a bit more of a long-term problem. When it came time for the surgery, I stopped breathing multiple times on the table, and they couldn't stabilize me enough to continue the procedure. Luckily, by this time they had already placed the G-tube, but they were unable to advance it to a full GJ tube. I'm actually kind of glad it happened this way because I've been pretty happy with having just the G-tube so far, and we can always advance it later. What was the procedure like? Besides my problems breathing, the procedure itself went pretty smoothly. I remember being really nervous because they told me at the last second that it was going to be a twilight sedation, so I wouldn't be fully out, but the anesthesiologist was so sweet and she promised me over and over that I wouldn't remember anything, which is true, I really don't. When I woke up, I was sore and bandaged and I really wanted to see the tube, but they didn't let me take the bandages off until the next day when the resident came by. I was actually pretty shocked at how high they placed it. It's really about here, so it kind of feels like it's more in my chest. I remember my first question is, how the heck am I supposed to wear a bra with this thing? And the bewildered look on the resident's face as he kind of stuttered his way through his answer was just hilarious. At the end of it, he kind of came to I don't know, maybe, just don't wear one. I was like, alright, thanks, dude. But luckily, it did end up being okay. Was it hard to find the right formula? Yes, this was a very frustrating process. I told them all of the different trigger foods I had, and they were definitely a bit clueless. Although, to be fair, there are a lot of them. I told them that anything soy, dairy, or wheat-based, or anything with flavoring added, was not gonna fly. But they were pretty confident that everything was gonna be just fine. The first one they tried me on was their most hypoallergenic formula. It was completely dairy-based and full of vanilla flavoring, but they assured me that people with lactose intolerance usually do pretty well on it, which made me feel a lot better because I'm not even lactose intolerant. Anyway, as you can guess, that formula was absolutely horrible. I've probably never been so sick in my life, and the smell of vanilla still makes me gag. Like I said, this hospital was kind of clueless about this stuff. But luckily I wasn't going in completely blind, as a year prior, when I started to really have mast cell problems, I had started doing meal replacements by a company called Neocate. They make these little juice boxes that are hypoallergenic. They're called Splash, and I would drink those to get enough calories per day. So I was already familiar with that brand, and I knew I didn't react, but those juice boxes were more of a meal replacement than an actual formula. So I contacted the company directly, and it turns out they do make a tube feeding formula that is allergen-free and amino acid based. The hospital actually had some kind of contract with whatever feeding supply company that they use, so they were unable to ship this specific brand to their hospital. So they had to send me home to where we were staying out of state and then have that company ship their product directly to me. So the hospital literally sent me home with nothing, having basically not eaten anything in probably about 3 to 5 days. Luckily it worked. They came through. This is what I use. It is called Neocate Splash Unflavored. This is their tube feed. And the only problem with it is made for children, so it's really not very calorie dense. So I have to ingest a lot of it to get my daily recommended calories. Next question, do I have a Mickey button? And yes, I do, and I absolutely love it. If you didn't know, when they first place a feeding tube, either a G tube or a J tube, it's just kind of a long tube with a clamp, and it has a bumper, like a stopper, on the inside of your stomach so it can't get pulled out, and then it has a bumper out here on the outside so it can't get pushed in. It's kind of like when you get a piercing. This ensures that it has a good tract and nothing is going to be leaking into your abdominal cavity, which is good. The bad part is it sticks straight out at kind of an uncomfortable angle, and then you have this big long tube attached to you all the time, which you have to then fasten, and it gets pulled on and it's painful. A lot of people are fine with it, they just keep this tube, but I really wanted a lower profile option, especially since I was having allergic reactions to all of the different tapes that I needed to fasten it, and it was just annoying. You do have to wait a certain amount of time after you've had the feeding tube placed, just to make sure that the tract has properly formed, and then you can switch it out for something called a Mickey button. A Mickey button is kind of just a little valve that really sits almost flat up against your stomach, and then you can attach the extension tubing onto it to use it, and then detach the tubing when you're not using it. I can put up a picture of what my Mickey button looks like here, and this is what the extension tubing looks like. It's just this little tube that you push into the front of the valve and you twist it, and then you can attach it to a syringe if that's what you're using, or you can attach it to your feeding pump. Placing a Mickey button in a G tube is actually relatively easy, and they can usually do it in their office. A J tube is a bit more difficult. You might have to go under anesthesia for that. But for me, I was like, woohoo, let's just do this. What they don't tell you is that they have to yank the old tube through the hole in order to put the Mickey button in. Once you're starting to use Mickey buttons, it's not a big deal because they just have a little balloon that you fill up with water when it's in. You can deflate it to take it out, no big deal. But the first one has a big rubber bumper on the inside, like we talked about. And they don't give you any kind of numbing medication or really much warning. But they just place one hand in your stomach and the other on the tube and just yank it out. And it hurts really bad. And they pulled out one of my ribs. But it was so worth it. I love my Mickey button. Thank you, Mickey Button Company. Do I use bolus or pump feeding? When I first started with my feeding tube, I was strictly bolus feeding. Bolus feeding is kind of when you do like a large amount at once at intervals throughout the day, kind of like you would do with a meal. I would do, a box of this every so many hours or whatever. This worked okay for me at the beginning, but I started to notice I was just getting really dizzy and nauseous after I would do it, and I would have to go lie down. I would get so tired, and so it was just too much for me, and I wasn't able to take in as many calories as I needed throughout the day. In fact, I was probably taking in like half the amount of calories that I needed. So now, many months later, I have finally been able to start on a feeding pump. You have to kind of prove to your insurance company that you're unable to do bolus feedings before they will start to pay for a pump, which is kind of frustrating. I have actually really liked using the pump so far. The only real problem I have with it is that you are hooked up to it a lot. I'm hooked up to it about 12 to 14 hours a day, I'm actually quite lucky. A lot of people do it 24 hours a day. It just really depends on how quickly you can take in your formula, how thick your formula is, and how many calories per ounce is in it. The pump does come with this little backpack that it fits into in here, so that when you go out, you don't have to bring the IV pole with you. But it's still kind of annoying. I always walk away from the chair with my backpack still on it, and then I get like clotheslined by the feeding tube. But it is definitely worth it. And if I don't finish it during the day, I can run it at night as long as I remain pretty upright while I sleep, because you don't want it backing up into your throat or your lungs. Okay, so my camera died and I can't quite focus it the same, but we're gonna move on. Have I had any complications? Luckily, so far, I really haven't had many issues with it. I think because it's just a G-tube and not a GJ tube, there are fewer things that can go wrong. I have had some times, though, where I ended up with a lot of swelling and irritation, mostly because of my own clumsiness. Like I said, I'm always getting the tube caught on this or that, and it caused so much swelling in the area that the tube was kind of sitting sideways, if that makes sense, and it was bleeding and it was leaking and it was a mess. I went to the ER. They were totally clueless about Mickey buttons, so I went home and luckily it just kind of healed itself, I guess. That hasn't happened to me in a while because I started using these little clip things. They clip onto like your pants or your shirt. You can put them up here if you feed your tube up through this way, or you can put it down here if you like it to go down. But it's just basically this little clip, and then it's this little snap, so that when you inevitably yank on the tube, instead of the force going to the tube site, it catches here on the tube itself, on the clip. I'm not sponsored or anything, but the woman who makes these is on Etsy. Her name is Laura, and she is so incredible. I'm gonna link her below. Definitely check her out. These things have saved my life. Her shop name is Tickle Me Tubies, which I think is adorable. And luckily, because of these things, I've never yanked the tube out. Although I have had some close calls. And you do still have to carry around a replacement Mickey button kit with you in your size, because everyone has different sizes. So everyone's stomach is a different length from their abdominal wall, and you have to carry that with you in case it does get yanked out, because apparently the hole starts to close in like 20 minutes or something crazy like that, and then you have to start all over with surgery and the big old tube that you hate. So definitely carry around your Mickey button replacement kit. It is worth it. Another kind of minor issue I have with the tube is granulation tissue. Granulation tissue is quite common with this kind of thing, from what I understand. It's just kind of like some scar tissue that your body builds up around the edge of the site. A lot of times I think it's from rubbing and irritation or the stomach acid. It's just this very fragile red tissue that bleeds easily, and it's pretty painful. Last time I went to my doctor, she was able to cauterize some of it with some silver nitrate. It does sting quite a bit, but it definitely helped, and it mostly went away. Now it's back. I think I'll probably have her do it again next time I see her. And one thing that helps me a lot with the granulation tissue and the site irritation, these little tube pads. You'll have seen that I'm wearing one in the picture of the Mickey button that I showed you earlier, but they're just these little pads. They have, you know, soft fabric on the back, and you can get fun fabric on the front, and they just go around the tube and snap in place. Keep the tube and the Mickey button from rubbing too much and irritating the tube site, as well as absorbing anything that might leak out. Now, leaking is something that I've only recently started to have a problem with. Because my back pain has been so severe, the muscles get very, very tight across my abdomen and chest, and that can sometimes cause problems when I disconnect the extension tube, all of the pressure of the muscles will cause some of my stomach contents and water to leak out of the Mickey button opening. So I've just been making sure that I'm always lying flat and relaxed when I disconnect it, and that I very quickly close the top of the valve. This question I get asked basically every day by basically everyone, and that is, do you miss food? Of course I miss food. Who wouldn't miss food? Most days I absolutely crave some kind of weird, strange food that I never even liked before. But hey, it's just not worth it. It's not worth the symptoms. It's not worth the misery. And like, for the first time in my life, I'm not nauseous every single second. I can finally, have the freedom of going places without having to constantly worry about what I'm going to eat and how I'm going to feel. And that way it's been really liberating. It used to be that if I had plans for something, I wouldn't eat that whole day and maybe the day before, just to ensure that I felt well enough to keep those plans. And so, do I spend some of my nights going through Instagram and wishing I could eat all of those awesome looking foods? Yeah. But that's just gonna have to be enough for me right now. I know that people look at having a feeding tube placed as this awful, awful last resort thing. And although it should be your last resort, it's not always that bad. People can live totally normal, full lives with feeding tubes. I have to say, it's been a huge blessing to my life. So, last question, am I glad I have it? Yes. Alright guys, that is it for today. Thank you so much for leaving your questions and all of the messages that you guys have been sending. It means so much to me to hear from you and to hear your stories, and it definitely helps put a face to this, I guess I would say. Sometimes it's really strange just sitting here in your room by yourself talking to a camera. So when I hear from you guys and I get to see your pictures, I just feel like I'm talking to friends. If you have any more questions or you feel like there was something I missed, please feel free to leave it in the comments, or you can message me either here or on Instagram or on Facebook. I love to answer your questions. It's not a bother to me, so ask away, and I will see you guys next time.